Back in the 60s, I was influenced by a philosopher in New York City who used to talk about a couple of major principles that were critical elements of being a complete human being. And he spoke of the spirit of festivity and the spirit of fantasy. And as I understood it, by festivity, he meant the ability to periodically put aside the problems and concerns of the moment, join with one's friends, and joyously celebrate the past. And the spirit of fantasy was that ability to dream of new lifestyles for the future. And it seems to me that what we're trying to do today is enjoy and encourage those two spirits. We have a lot of Dan's old friends here who I hope will have fun putting aside the problems of the moment and joyously having some wonderful celebrations of the accomplishments of the past. But by the end of the day, we also want to take a look at the attention of where do we stand now on human rights and what challenges can we meet in the future. So we start the day with some festivity and celebration of Dan Hill in his personal life and as a father and husband. And for my position in today's work, I see a number of people out there who fought some real battles with Dan back in the 60s. And I was not playing that kind of role with Dan. When I met Dan, I was a young teacher who had just completed creating the African Students Foundation that started to bring African students to this country when there were no government scholarships. And we had created a nonprofit called Crossroads Africa to take young Canadians out to Africa. And that had led me, as Michelle mentions, to connect with the community of Buxton, and for me to start to connect with a community in my own country that I, up till that point, had been completely unaware of. The experience in Buxton and dreaming about that museum and engaging in oral history to try to find the stories was a life-changing experience for me. And it was in that context, when I was still a young teacher in London, Ontario, that I first met your father. And so he was a mentor for me. I can't claim to have done anything to help him with his work, but he, as you both well know, had a tremendous capacity for pushing someone to, if that's what you're going to do, get on and do it, right? And anytime I began to lag a bit or wonder whether I was right to be even trying to play this role, your dad would be saying, just cut the crap and get to work and get it done. So he came to our home in London, Ontario, and had dinner with my family a number of times. And I remember particularly times when he began to talk about the two boys and Karen, and I'll make some more comments about that as we go along. So my connection with the Hill family is a very personal one, and that's how we start the day, on a personal basis. And I'm going to lead into the family discussion by giving Larry the spotlight in a moment. And Larry and I had not met actually until last year. I had been influenced by his writings, had been, fascinated, as many of us were, by his latest book, The Book of Negroes, partly because it's such a marvelous read, but partly because I had spent a fair amount of time in Sierra Leone and had interacted with the generations of children who came out of that Nova Scotia environment and went back to West Africa. But it was a surprise to me at the 50th anniversary of Crossroads to go to that celebration and see Larry up on the stage. And it was only at that point that I realized he had been part of our family of Crossroaders, and in fact, Crossroads had played a role in helping him shape some of the background for his work, and particularly his most successful novel. But I knew Larry and remembered him in a different way, not from the writings of the book, but from a piece he wrote in the Toronto Star. And I told him that I can remember where I was sitting when I read that newspaper back in 2003 called "Dad Will Always Live Within Us," a tribute to Dan Hill by his son. And I remember being very emotional at the end of reading this piece, thinking what kind of father this man was to have a son who writes something like this after you when you leave. And I began to ask myself the questions, what would my boys be writing about me after I left? But let me lead you into Larry with a little insert from this piece about Dan Hill, the motivator. And Larry writes about, "Dad ruled the household with a mix of bravado and intimidation, but he also knew how to motivate us. When I was 7, able to print in block letters, but not yet in cursive script, my best friend had a cat with a litter of kittens, and I absolutely had to have one. No, son. Please, Dad, I really want a kitten. I said no. Kittens grow up to be cats, and I don't like cats. But Dad, I just have to have one, and it's a certain one. Her name is Smokey. If you really want that cat, Larry, then go write me a letter. Tell me whose allowance is going to pay for cat food. And don't forget to set out who will care for that cat, who will clean out its litter box and prevent it from having babies. Make sure this letter is well written with no spelling mistakes. If you do a good job, I'll give your request some consideration." Larry says, "I retreated to my bedroom, convinced in every molecule of my body of the importance of my task. If I wrote powerfully, if I'd get what I wanted. There was somebody going to pay close attention to my words. Somebody who cared about what spilled out of my mind and how it lifted off the paper. Dad loomed large as my living, breathing, critical audience. He forced me to imagine a reader who was smarter than me. Hot damn, did he ever make me want to write?" Larry, take over.
Thank you.
That little clip helps us take a moment to think of some context of the period in which Dan and Donna were doing their pioneering work, because there's a number of people in the audience who know that period well, who understand that the Canada of the 1960s was tremendously different than the country we know today. But there are younger people in the room and students in the room who hopefully through experiences like this get a sense of realization of where we've come from and what's happened in the last 50 years. Because the 60s it was in some ways a period of opportunity for young people. It was also an angry period. It ended up with 1968, the revolution of young people around the world, that set the pace for the next quarter century of life. And certainly it was an age in which discrimination was rampant, that our country was settling into its first struggles to start to turn around the laws of immigration and rights that had been fundamentally racist for most of the century. And so when I lead into introducing Dan, I pull out of my file of the Hill family comments that Dan was asked to make on the 50th anniversary of the book To Kill a Mockingbird. And it was interesting to me that writers and journalists in this age would take the time to look at that book and use it as another defining piece of helping us realize where we've come. And for, again, those of you in the audience who haven't read To Kill a Mockingbird, it might prompt you to pick it up and read it. But I'd like to start by reading what Dan said in one of his interviews about this book. And he was using the book to talk a lot about life in Toronto and life in your family and your role as a child of mixed racial parents, finding their way in the schools of this city. Talking about the book, Dan says, "It made me think once more, retching time about my own family. It also left me with some small hope that despite society's unspeakable cruelties, there remains at the very core of human existence unconditional love. The beauty of Mockingbird is that the longing for human connection of random acts of kindness keeps popping up, always when you least expect it." So when you hear Larry talking about the background of the Hill family, of Lincoln University, I hadn't realized the connection with Lincoln. If you don't know Lincoln University was the founding place for Dr. Jim Robinson, our mentor in Crossroads Africa. It was the school that prepared many of the first generation of independent African states leaders, and I find out today it's part of the roots of your family. And so to Dan Hill, education was absolutely critical. Right? That's the way you were going to rise above racial inequality. So you can picture him sitting at our dinner table in London, Ontario, and my children are dutifully sitting there because Dad has a guest and says, you know, you should behave and listen. And they're trying hard to be interested in the talk about human rights. And then we start talking about the family. And Dan talks about Donna and talks about Karen and her poetry and talks about Larry going to be a good writer. And then he said, and then there's Danny. And I don't think Dan will be concerned with these comments because he's lived and written about them. But I'm sitting there and saying, Danny, yeah, well, Danny's got this crazy idea that he can make a living in life by playing a guitar and singing some songs. And at that point, my young 13-year-old daughter starts sitting up and says, Dan Hill? Your dad says, yeah. Dan Hill, the singer? You know, yeah. Well, I hadn't been listening to his early records, but my daughter then couldn't wait to get away from the table and tell her friends, you just had supper with the father of Dan Hill, the singer. You know? But for me, Dan kept pushing me, Don, I want you to talk to my son. And so actually, Dan and I met once before today when he was a young singer, and we met in a coffee shop. And I said to him, Dan, I'm not sure why we're supposed to be meeting. And he said, tell me about your background. I said, well, I'm a teacher. And he said, I know why we're supposed to be meeting. You're to convince me that I should be keeping on with my education. So that was until today, my only direct contact with Dan. And of course, I came to love his music. But the real emotional impact came when, after his father's death, he wrote the book, I Am My Father's Son. And when I read the book, I phoned Michelle right away and told her she had to get a hold of a copy of the book. I bought 4 copies of the book and sent them to my 4 children. And I sent them with a covering note reminding them of Dan being at our dinner table. And I closed my letter to my own children with these words. Last week I read this book in a rush. It was my most emotional reading experience for years, and my tears flowed freely at many points. It also caused me to stop many times to reflect on my life, on my dreams, my fears, my successes, my failures, and particularly my relationship with your mother and all of you. So please find time to read the book. It's a good read in its own right, but it might help you to understand the paradox that is your own father. So you can see there is, for me, some very personal relationships with how this family has influenced my family. Before I invite Dan to come up to the front and talk to you and share some music, the thing that struck me reading the book, Dan, and we shared it just early this morning, was people know Dan through the songs that he sings and records. But not as many Canadians realize that this is a force in the music industry behind the scenes, writing songs for other performers. And so it was a surprise to me to realize that many of the other music that I was enjoying in life was actually coming from this man's heart and mind. Songs by George Benson, by Tina Turner, by Britney Spears, one by Oscar Peterson, and a number by Celine Dion. So I would ask you now to warmly welcome to the front stage, Dan Hill.